All right, Sagar, what's on your radar?
Well, it's the holiday season, so I hate to be such a bummer, but the stimulus story is one that I just feel has to be relentlessly discussed here. So all of you truly understand just how much of a bipartisan failure this entire process has been, and so that you know exactly who to blame in 5 years when we're staring down the barrel of an addiction crisis, a personal debt crisis, and a youth revolt. Yesterday, we covered a very interesting story from the New York Times about how people inside Joe Biden's team were contemplating whether Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer should simply play ball with Mitch McConnell and accept his offer of $500 billion. Sure, it's way lower than it needs to be, they said, but given that they're likely to get a double-dip recession without more stimulus, something is better than nothing. We praise that move here, while noting clearly that Pelosi explicitly held out on a $1.8 trillion offer before the election and didn't move forward with it because she didn't want to give Trump a win before the election. But it seems that even those rumblings inside the campaign were too much, because shortly after we wrapped our show yesterday, we saw this update from the Biden campaign saying, any indication the Biden team is pressuring Pelosi to take McConnell's deal is incorrect, and that, quote, the president-elect fully supports the speaker and leader in their negotiations. Which, in other words, means that Joe Biden supports Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer's hardline position that the only legislation they're willing to pass is the bill that they wrote. Think about that very clearly. The position of the incoming administration is that Democratic leaders in Congress should not seriously work towards getting money in the hands of Americans during a very tough winter in which coronavirus is spiking and in which American citizens have not received money from their government in suitable amounts in nearly 7 months. Now, why, oh why, would they do that? We all know the answer. It's the same one as to why Pelosi refused to cut a deal with Trump before the election. These people do not give a damn whatsoever about actual Americans. It's all just about getting the credit. Pelosi, Biden, Schumer, they want to wait until they're possibly in charge and then pass anything. And here's the idiotic part. If the Georgia Senate races, they go the way that I think they're going to go, McConnell will still be calling the shots. It's very unlikely they'll have many Republicans who will deviate from their current position on stimulus, which means you're going to end up with some stimulus figure below like $1 trillion and isn't all that different from the $500 billion that they could pass right now. That doesn't matter to them because, once again, their aim is not to alleviate suffering. It's to prolong it and then throw you peanuts so that they can ride the political headwinds of possible recovery. And who knows, maybe they are right to do so. Maybe people are so fleeting that they will go along and give them credit. But maybe people will also remember. One of the things I got wrong before the 2020 election was that people, I thought, would punish Trump much harder for not working to pass a second stimulus bill. They didn't. In fact, many people who voted for him explicitly said they were doing so because of the economic message and because they believed he was doing everything he could possibly do in order to help them out during this crisis. And yeah, it's undeniable he likely suffered for not passing it, but he wasn't the only one. Nancy Pelosi's genius strategy cost the Democrats 27 out of 27 elections in toss-up districts, literally over 27. And yes, I believe some of that was defund the police and socialism sucks and all that. But what if some of it was also the fact that they wanted to make Democrats pay for screwing around on stimulus negotiations? In other words, what if voters are smarter than these politicians think they are? And they know that Washington is screwing around, jockeying for credit instead of jockeying to do the right thing at the appointed moment in a crisis. I believe this is very much the case, and people are going to remember these types of shenanigans for a long time to come. What's so terrible about it is that everybody is responsible. Trump and Pelosi, McConnell, Mnuchin, everyone. Yeah, Pelosi passed some fake Democratic wish lists, but she never once actually worked to compromise on a single issue. That's not leadership or good faith. And yeah, Trump only paid attention whenever he realized he needed a stimulus right before the election. McConnell, well, not really much has changed on his end. The Biden team should heed that lesson. If they have a GOP Senate and there hasn't been any stimulus passed, then they and Nancy Pelosi are the only ones to really blame. And I believe they will pay a price, because one of the things that those Biden advisors who leaked to the New York Times got right is that there is indeed a double dip recession coming. A vaccine is great, and going back to normal is great. But normal after 9 months of massive contraction, business failure, and a wealth transfer upward is simply not going to feel that way for millions. The economy for younger Americans is a disaster. Wages are going to be flat for a long time, given how many people are permanently unemployed. And the opportunity cost socially is something that we will be dealing with for far too long of a time to come. And I keep thinking about that, Crystal, which is that they're jockeying themselves to try and get all the credit whenever they come into office. Number one, it's immoral, but these people don't speak that language. So let's say politically, is it beneficial? I don't think so. I think people are going to remember, as they did with the House Democrats, saying, no, you guys did not work hard enough. And what did a lot of those swing state people say it before the election? They were like, hey, we really need to cut a deal because we're getting pressured. It turned out to be a disaster for them. Yeah, no, that's absolutely right. And look, a lot of how Joe Biden's administration will ultimately be perceived will be out of his hands in terms of, is the vaccine effective? Are people able to get back to normal? Does the economy sort of naturally recover as we move out of the pandemic? But also a lot of the ground that will be laid for his administration is happening right now. Yes. Like the longer we let people suffer and struggle, the harder it's going to be to recover, the more permanent scarring that you have in the economy that takes not just years, but decades to overcome. There is an absolutely heartbreaking story in the Washington Post about indications that the suicide rate is climbing and climbing and climbing, especially among young Americans. And these are this data, it's hard to come by. You really won't know the full picture until about 2 years from now when we finally get the statistics about what is going on right now. Same thing with the addiction crisis. But we've talked to journalists who see massive spikes in key parts of the country. But this stat stunned me. 75% of young Americans are dealing with either a mental health issue or an addiction issue right now. 75%. Think about that. Like, what does that say about your country? That your young people who should be filled with hope and spirit and go-get-em attitude and coming into the world, coming into their careers, forging their lives, starting families are so miserable that 3/4 of them are struggling with these issues right now. And when you look at what goes on in Washington and you lay out the culpability, which goes, there isn't a single good actor, not one that you can point to, and you start to understand how people feel so miserable and so hopeless because this little window that we've had in the stimulus negotiations, when people are in their most dire time of need, that is par for the course for the way that things actually work around here. It's much more about how do I position myself to get the credit or more likely to avoid the blame than it is how do I actually deliver something that is going to help people get through this very difficult time. They literally know that their crisis and a recession is coming, and they are not going to do anything about it. Like, look, $500 billion is not great. Will it stop a recession? Probably not. But it's something. And this is a $1, $3 problem, as it's been described to me, which is that for every dollar that it costs in prevention, if you don't do it, it'll take you $3 more in order to make up the cost. It intuitively makes sense. You let a restaurant go out. You either pay restaurants payroll, but then you have to let them go out of business. Then you have to create all these programs. And you have to try the workers and reattach them to a workforce. It's a disaster. It takes a long time. Yeah. And guess what? The end part, the follow through, never happens in Washington. Surprise, surprise. Which is that you get the bailouts for the people at the top or whomever, and as long as they're taken care of, all good. And you see this playing out so clearly. But I think they're wrong. I really do. I do not think people are going to let this go unnoticed. They are going to know that basically this election was a pox on both your houses. They were like, yeah, we're sick of Trump. But in terms of the House Democrats, it wasn't like an affirmation of Joe Biden and Nancy Pelosi and Chuck Schumer's vision. They barely hang on to their majority. It's like 3 seats that they have their majority by. The Senate Dems were counting their chips. I mean, they're most likely, in my view, are probably not going to be in control. Think about that. After all the Teresa Greenfield and Jamie Harrison hype and all of that, GOP is still there. So what does that tell you? People hate Washington. They really do. And all the most Washington players basically got repudiated in this thing. And people need to remember that because they're going to see that in a couple of years from now, we're like, we passed a $700 billion. They're going to be like, yeah, but you could have given me 1.8. Yeah. Don't forget that. They could have given you double what you're most likely to get. And I think people should pay a price for that. I really do. The last thing I do want to say is I think this period of Trump's presidency is honestly the most unconscionable. Here we are with pandemic numbers spiking,
climbing up back again to 1,000, 2,000 deaths a day. 49 out of 50 states are classified as having uncontrolled spread of COVID. We're in a crisis there, with the pandemic, crisis on healthcare, crisis in the economy, and all he can do is suck his thumb and rage tweet and plan his holiday vacation in Mar-a-Lago. I think it is the most, we set the bar really low for this guy because we don't really expect any different, but it is an unconscionable abdication of duty when Americans are in deep crisis right now, and this guy's completely absent from duty.
I agree with you.
All right.
I'm looking forward to your Radar Next, Crystal.